The gentle hum of the car engine filled the late-night silence as Captain Patricia Wright drove through the quiet streets of Chicago. The clock on her dashboard read 11:45 p.m., and the scattered streetlights cast long shadows across her tired face. She'd just wrapped up another exhausting day at the Internal Affairs Division, where she'd spent hours reviewing case files of reported police misconduct. 20 years on the force had taught her many things, but nothing quite prepared her for the challenges of leading the Internal Affairs team. Today's cases had been particularly troubling. 3 separate incidents of excessive force during routine traffic stops. As she waited at a red light, she couldn't help but think about the young officer she'd interviewed earlier. His excuses about feeling threatened had sounded hollow, especially when the dashcam footage showed a completely different story. The streets were mostly empty now, with just a few late-night workers heading home and the occasional delivery truck rumbling past. Patricia adjusted her rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her reflection. She'd changed out of her uniform hours ago into comfortable civilian clothes, a simple blue sweater and black pants. Her badge and ID were tucked safely in her purse, as they always were when she worked undercover investigations. The radio played softly in the background, some late-night talk show discussing the city's latest efforts to improve community policing. Patricia allowed herself a small smile, thinking about how much had changed since she'd first joined the force. Back then, being both black and female in law enforcement meant facing twice the challenges. Now, as a captain, she was in a position to make real change happen. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, probably another message from her daughter about tomorrow's family dinner. Patricia had promised to cook her famous pot roast, assuming no emergencies came up at work. 20 years of missed dinners and rescheduled family events had taught her daughter not to get her hopes up too high. As she turned onto Lakeshore Drive, the city skyline sparkled against the dark sky. The lake breeze carried the familiar mix of city sounds, distant sirens, the rumble of the L train, and the endless hum of traffic. This was her city, her home, and despite its flaws, she loved it fiercely. Something caught her attention in the rearview mirror, headlights getting closer. The car behind her had been following for the last few blocks, maintaining the same distance. Patricia's trained eye noticed it was a patrol car, though she couldn't make out the unit number in the darkness. Her mind automatically went through her driving checklist. She was going exactly the speed limit, her tags were current, and all her lights were working. There was no reason for anyone to pull her over. The patrol car's lights suddenly flashed to life, painting the inside of her car in alternating blue and red. Patricia checked her speedometer again, still perfectly at the limit. With 2 decades of experience, she knew exactly what to do. She signaled and pulled over smoothly, positioning her car safely on the shoulder. Her hands moved to the steering wheel, visible at 10 and 2, just as she'd trained countless rookie officers to do. As she waited for the officer to approach, Patricia thought about all those case files on her desk. Each one represented someone's story, someone's encounter with law enforcement that had gone wrong. She'd never imagined she'd be adding her own experience to that collection. The tap on her window came harder than necessary, the flashlight beam unnecessarily bright in her eyes. She could make out the silhouette of a male officer, stance aggressive rather than professional. In that moment, Patricia made a decision. She wouldn't immediately identify herself as a captain. Her position in internal affairs had taught her that sometimes the best way to address a problem was to experience it firsthand. Little did she know, this traffic stop was about to become much more than just another case file. It would spark a chain of events that would shake the department to its core and force everyone to confront the uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and justice that still lurked beneath the surface of the badge. The flashlight beam continued to shine directly into Patricia's eyes as Officer Reynolds approached her window. She could feel her heart rate picking up, not from fear, but from a deep, familiar disappointment. After 20 years on the force, she knew what was coming before he even opened his mouth. "License and registration," he barked, not bothering with the customary greeting or explanation for the stop. His tone was sharp enough to cut glass. Through the glare of the flashlight, Patricia could see his partner hanging back by their patrol car, body language suggesting discomfort with the situation. Patricia kept her movements slow and deliberate. "May I reach for my purse to get my license?" she asked calmly, following the same protocol she'd taught in countless training sessions. Her own dashboard camera was quietly recording everything, a habit she'd developed over years of internal investigations. "Just hurry up," Officer Reynolds snapped, his free hand resting unnecessarily on his holster. The gesture wasn't lost on Patricia, who'd spent years teaching proper traffic stop procedures. Everything about this stop was wrong, from the aggressive approach to the threatening posture. As she reached for her purse, Officer Reynolds suddenly banged his hand against her car roof. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he shouted, contradicting his own order from seconds ago. Patricia froze, her hands returning to the steering wheel. "Sir," she began, maintaining her professional tone, "you just told me to get my license. I need to reach for my purse to do that. Would you like me to get my license or keep my hands on the wheel?" The question seemed to irritate him further. "Don't get smart with me," he growled, leaning closer to the window. "Step out of the vehicle." Patricia noticed more cars slowing down as they passed, some passengers already holding up phones to record. The blue and red lights painted everything in surreal colors, reflecting off the windows of nearby buildings. She could see Officer Reynolds' partner shifting uncomfortably in the background, clearly struggling with whether to intervene. "Officer," Patricia said firmly but respectfully, "I haven't been told why I'm being stopped. I was driving within the speed limit and following all traffic laws. Could you please explain the reason for this stop?" Instead of answering, Officer Reynolds tried the door handle. Finding it locked, he banged on the window again. "I said get out of the vehicle. Are you refusing to comply with a police officer?" A small crowd was gathering on the sidewalk now. Patricia could hear murmurs of concern and saw more phones being raised to record the scene. She thought about all the similar videos that had crossed her desk, all the complaints she'd reviewed where situations had spiraled out of control. "Officer Reynolds," she said, reading his nameplate in the reflection of her side mirror, "I'm happy to comply with reasonable requests, but I need to understand why I'm being stopped. This is my right as a citizen." His face contorted with anger at her measured response. "Your taillight is out," he spat, though Patricia knew this wasn't true. She checked all her lights just yesterday during a routine maintenance check. The partner finally stepped forward, his pneumatic reading Officer Chen. "Hey Reynolds, maybe we should," he started, but Reynolds cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Call for backup," Reynolds ordered his partner, never taking his eyes off Patricia. "We've got someone refusing to comply." Patricia remained calm, though her mind was racing. She thought about her daughter waiting at home, about the countless times she'd reviewed similar situations from behind her desk. Now she was living it, and the reality was even more disturbing than the reports suggested. Through her open window, she could hear someone in the crowd saying, "This ain't right." Another voice was explaining to a newcomer, "She didn't do nothing, he just pulled her over." The number of witnesses was growing, their phones capturing every moment of this increasingly tense situation. Officer Chen's voice crackled over the radio, requesting backup, but his tone conveyed uncertainty. Patricia knew that tone well. It was the sound of someone who knew things were going wrong, but didn't know how to stop it. More patrol cars were approaching now, their sirens growing louder. Patricia took a deep breath, knowing the next few minutes would be crucial. She had a choice to make: continue allowing this situation to unfold to document the full extent of Officer Reynolds' misconduct, or reveal her rank and end it now. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just hours ago, she'd been reviewing cases of officer misconduct, and now she was gathering first-hand evidence. But this wasn't just about one traffic stop or one officer anymore. This was about all the others who'd faced similar treatment without her position of authority to protect them. As backup units pulled up, their lights adding to the chaotic display of red and blue, Patricia knew this night would change more than just her own perspective on police conduct. It would become a testament to why reform was necessary and why her work in internal affairs was more important than ever. Red and blue lights now flooded the entire street as 3 more patrol cars pulled up to the scene. Patricia watched in her mirrors as officers stepped out of their vehicles, some looking confused by the growing crowd of onlookers. The night air was thick with tension, broken only by the crackle of police radios and the murmur of the gathering spectators. Officer Reynolds seemed emboldened by the arrival of backup. "Last warning," he announced, his voice carrying across the now silent street. "Exit the vehicle, or we will remove you by force." Patricia noticed one of the newly arrived officers was Lieutenant Thompson, someone she'd worked with on several internal affairs cases. He hadn't recognized her yet in the chaos of flashing lights and shadows. She could see him taking in the scene, his experienced eyes noting the unnecessarily aggressive stance of Officer Reynolds and the growing crowd of witnesses. "I need to reach for my identification," Patricia stated clearly, making sure her voice would be picked up by both her dashboard camera and the body cameras of all officers present. "I am going to move my right hand slowly toward my purse. Is that acceptable?" Officer Reynolds' response was to slam his hand against her car roof again. The sharp bang made several people in the crowd jump. "Out, now," he shouted, reaching for his car door handle. That's when Officer Chen finally found his voice. "Reynolds, hold up," he called out, taking a step forward. "She's being reasonable. Let's just—" "Stay back," Reynolds snapped at his partner. This is exactly how these people act when they're hiding something. Always playing games, always thinking they know their rights better than we do. The racial undertone in his voice was unmistakable. Patricia heard gasps from the crowd, followed by angry murmurs. She glanced in her rearview mirror and saw Lieutenant Thompson's posture change as he picked up on the situation's dangerous direction. Patricia's phone lay on the passenger seat, still recording. She'd conducted enough investigations to know that multiple sources of evidence were crucial. The growing number of civilian recordings would help too. She could see at least 15 phones raised in the air now. Officer Reynolds moved to her door, and Patricia knew the moment of choice had arrived. She could feel the situation balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong move from anyone could send things spiraling out of control. "Step back from the vehicle, Officer Reynolds," a new voice cut through the tension. Lieutenant Thompson had finally moved forward, his tone carrying the weight of authority. Something's not right here. But Reynolds was too far gone in his power trip. He yanked at Patricia's door handle again, his face twisted with anger when he found it still locked. "Breaking this window in 3 seconds if you don't unlock it." The crowd surged forward slightly, their concern visible. Patricia could hear someone saying they were live-streaming everything. Another voice was frantically describing the scene to a 911 operator, not realizing they were reporting police misconduct to the police themselves. "1," Reynolds shouted, his hand moving to his belt where his baton was holstered. Lieutenant Thompson was moving faster now, his experience telling him things were about to go very wrong. "Officer, stand down," he ordered, but Reynolds was already raising his baton. 2. Patricia took a deep breath. The teachable moment had reached its peak. She'd seen enough to know exactly what kind of officer Reynolds was, and she had more than enough evidence of his conduct. Now it was time to prevent things from going too far. She pressed the button to lower her window completely, then reached slowly but purposefully into her purse. The movement made Reynolds raise his baton higher, but she continued with deliberate calm. 3, he shouted, starting to swing the baton toward her window. Patricia's hand emerged from her purse holding not just her driver's license, but also her police captain's badge and ID. She held them up, letting the patrol car lights catch the gold shield. "Captain Patricia Wright, Internal Affairs Division," she announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. "Officer Reynolds, lower your weapon immediately." The baton froze mid-swing. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft whir of dozens of phones still recording. Officer Reynolds' face went through a rapid series of expressions: anger, confusion, shock, and finally, the dawning horror of recognition. Lieutenant Thompson had reached them by now, his own expression showing relief mixed with grim understanding. He knew, as did everyone watching, that this incident would have far-reaching consequences for the department. Patricia kept her voice level as she continued, "Officer Reynolds, please step back from my vehicle. Lieutenant Thompson, I believe it's time we had a serious discussion about proper traffic stop procedures and the appropriate use of force." The crowd had erupted into excited whispers and exclamations as they realized what they'd just witnessed. Some were already sharing their videos online, spreading the story of how a power-drunk officer had unknowingly tried to abuse his authority with the very person in charge of policing the police. The next few minutes unfolded like a scene from a movie, but this was all too real. Officer Reynolds had backed away from Patricia's car, his baton now hanging limply at his side. The confidence and aggression that had fueled his actions moments ago had evaporated, replaced by a pale, shocked expression that spoke volumes. Lieutenant Thompson took immediate control of the situation. "Everyone back to your vehicles," he ordered the other officers, his voice steady but stern. "Officer Reynolds, surrender your weapon and badge to Officer Chen. You're on immediate administrative leave pending investigation." The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger, their phones still recording every moment. Someone in the back shouted, "That's what karma looks like." Another voice called out, "Show this everywhere. People need to see this." Patricia stepped out of her car now, her movements deliberate and dignified. The gold captain's badge caught the light from the patrol cars, drawing all eyes to it. She'd worn that badge for 5 years, but tonight it felt heavier than ever. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice carrying across the now quiet street, "I want every officer's body camera footage from this incident preserved. Nothing gets deleted, nothing gets accidentally overwritten. Is that clear?" Thompson nodded, already pulling out his phone to make the necessary calls. The other officers stood in a loose circle, their expressions a mix of shock, embarrassment, and, from some of the younger ones, what looked like relief that someone had finally caught this kind of behavior on camera. Officer Chen stepped forward, still looking shaken. "Captain, I should have done more. I knew something wasn't right from the start." Patricia turned to him, aware that everyone was watching this interaction. "Officer Chen, your discomfort with the situation was clear. But discomfort isn't enough. When you see something wrong, you have a duty to act. That's what the badge means." The crowd had started to thin out, but not before many had copied down badge numbers and car numbers. Social media was already buzzing. Patricia could hear people reading out comments from the live streams. This incident would be all over the news by morning. Officer Reynolds stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief as Officer Chen collected his badge and weapon. "Captain, I didn't. I was just following procedure for a suspicious vehicle." "Was I suspicious because of how I was driving?" Patricia asked calmly, "Or was I suspicious because of how I look?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Several of the remaining onlookers nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. Lieutenant Thompson returned from making his calls. "Captain, the chief is on his way. He wants to meet with you immediately." "Good," Patricia replied, "because we have a lot to discuss." She turned to address all the officers present. "What happened here tonight isn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. This is about a system that sometimes forgets its purpose. We wear these badges to protect and serve everyone equally and fairly." She walked over to her car and retrieved her phone, stopping the recording. "Officer Reynolds, you're probably wondering why I didn't identify myself immediately. Why I let this situation play out." She paused, making sure everyone could hear her next words. "It's because I needed to experience what countless citizens go through. I needed clear evidence of how a routine traffic stop can turn dangerous not because of the citizen's actions, but because of an officer's assumptions." Some of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering similar situations they'd witnessed or been part of. Patricia noticed their reactions, making mental notes. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but moments like this could be powerful catalysts. The sound of more sirens approached, probably the chief's car. Patricia could already picture tomorrow's meetings, the reports that would need to be filed, the investigations that would follow. But for now, she had one more thing to say. To everyone who recorded this incident, she addressed the remaining onlookers. "Thank you. Accountability works both ways. The public needs to be accountable to law enforcement, yes, but we must also be accountable to the public. That's not just policy, that's justice." The chief's car pulled up, its lights adding to the already bright scene. As he stepped out, Patricia could see the grim determination on his face. He'd been pushing for departmental reforms for months, often meeting resistance. Now he had something concrete to work with, undeniable evidence of why those reforms were necessary. Officer Reynolds was escorted to a waiting vehicle, his career effectively over. But Patricia wasn't celebrating. There was no victory in exposing this kind of behavior, only the hope that it would lead to meaningful change. She thought about all the similar incidents that had happened without a captain's badge to bring things to a halt, all the citizens who hadn't been as fortunate as she was tonight. As the chief approached, Patricia straightened her shoulders. The real work was just beginning. This incident would become more than just another case file. It would become a turning point, a case study in police training academies, a reminder that the badge came with both power and responsibility. By morning, the incident had exploded across social media. Patricia sat in her office at Internal Affairs, watching various news channels cover the story on muted screens while she reviewed the pile of reports on her desk. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Calls from reporters, community leaders, and police officials from other cities. 1 week after the incident, the police department's largest conference room was packed for the disciplinary hearing. The usual cold formality of these proceedings had been replaced by an atmosphere of intense public interest. Community members, officers, and media representatives filled every available seat, with more people watching via video feed in overflow rooms. Patricia sat at the front, her posture straight but not rigid. She'd spent the past week preparing for this moment, reviewing similar cases, gathering evidence, and most importantly, thinking about how to turn this incident into lasting change. "The hearing will come to order," announced the board chairperson, an older woman with decades of experience in police oversight. The room fell silent except for the soft click of news cameras. Officer Reynolds sat at a separate table with his union representative and lawyer. He looked different now. His uniform replaced by a dark suit, his previous arrogance replaced by visible anxiety. The videos playing on the screen behind him showed exactly why he had reason to be nervous. The footage started with his aggressive approach to Patricia's car. The room watched in silence as the scene unfolded from multiple angles, patrol car cameras, body cameras, and civilian phones all telling the same story. When they reached the moment where Reynolds raised his baton, several people in the audience gasped, even though they'd probably seen the clip before. "Captain Wright," the chairperson began, "please walk us through your experience that night." Patricia leaned toward the microphone. "I'd like to start by saying this isn't just about my experience. This hearing needs to address a larger issue. Every day, people face similar situations without the protection of a badge." She played her own dashboard camera footage, then the audio from her phone recording. The evidence was overwhelming, but Patricia wasn't interested in just punishing one officer. She pulled out a thick folder. "In preparing for this hearing, I reviewed Officer Reynolds' previous complaints. Over the past 3 years, there were 7 incidents of aggressive behavior during traffic stops. All 7 involved minority drivers. All 7 were dismissed without thorough investigation." The union representative tried to object, but Patricia continued. "This isn't about attacking the police force. It's about making it better. Every complaint that gets brushed aside, every incident that gets covered up, damages the trust between police and the community we're supposed to protect." Officer Chen was called to testify next. He'd spent the week working with Internal Affairs, providing details about other incidents he'd witnessed. His hands shook slightly as he spoke, but his voice was clear. "I knew things weren't right that night," he admitted. "I knew it wasn't the first time. But I told myself it wasn't my place to speak up. I was wrong. Being a good officer means doing what's right, not what's easy." The hearing continued through the afternoon. More officers came forward, describing similar incidents they'd witnessed or times they'd stayed silent when they should have spoken up. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle of how such behavior had gone unchecked for so long. Patricia noticed some of the younger officers in the audience taking notes. They seemed to understand that this wasn't just about punishing one person, it was about learning how to be better officers themselves. When it was Reynolds' turn to speak, he tried to defend his actions with familiar excuses: split-second decisions, officer safety, high crime area. But the words rang hollow against the clear video evidence. "Officer Reynolds," Patricia interrupted, "I want to ask you one question. When you approached my car that night, what exactly made you decide I was suspicious?" The room went completely still. Reynolds opened his mouth, closed it, then looked down at the table. His silence said more than any answer could have. The chairperson called a brief recess, and Patricia stepped into the hallway. Community leaders were huddled in small groups, discussing what they'd heard. Officers were talking quietly among themselves, some looking uncomfortable, others nodding with determination. Her daughter had been texting updates about the social media response. The hashtag #BadgeOfJustice was trending, with people sharing their own stories of traffic stops gone wrong. But they weren't just sharing complaints. They were also highlighting examples of good police work, showing what was possible when officers did their jobs right. When the hearing resumed, the board's decision was unanimous. Reynolds' resignation was accepted, his pension reduced, and his law enforcement certification would be reviewed by the state board. But that wasn't the most important outcome. The chief stood up to announce immediate changes. Mandatory bias training would be expanded, the complaint review process would be overhauled, and a new citizen oversight committee would be formed. Officers who reported misconduct would receive protection from retaliation. "This department exists to serve and protect everyone," the chief declared. "Today, we're taking steps to make sure we live up to that promise." Patricia looked around the room as the hearing concluded. Some faces showed relief, others determination, and a few showed resistance to change. She knew the real work was just beginning. Changing policies was one thing, changing hearts and minds would take longer. But as she watched officers and community members talking together after the hearing, sharing ideas about how to build trust and improve training, she felt hopeful. Sometimes it took a dramatic moment to open people's eyes, but it was the quiet work afterward that really made a difference. 6 months had passed since that fateful night, and the Chicago Police Department looked different now. Patricia stood at the podium in the police academy's main lecture hall, facing a class of fresh-faced recruits. Behind her, the screen showed dash cam footage from that night, but this time it was being used as a teaching tool. "What you just watched isn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong," she told the attentive faces before her. "It's about the choices we make every day when we put on this badge." The training program had been completely revamped. Instead of just teaching procedures and protocols, it now included extensive sessions on bias recognition, de-escalation techniques, and the importance of speaking up when witnessing misconduct. Officer Chen, now promoted to training coordinator, stood at the back of the room. He'd become one of the department's most vocal advocates for change, using his own experience to show other officers why staying silent wasn't an option. "Your fellow officers aren't your enemies when they hold you accountable," Patricia continued, walking among the recruits. "They're your allies in maintaining the trust we need to do our jobs effectively." The department's statistics told a remarkable story. Civilian complaints had dropped by 30%. More importantly, officers were now more likely to report problems they witnessed, knowing they'd be protected from retaliation. During breaks between sessions, Patricia often checked her phone. Community leaders kept her updated on the changes they were seeing on the streets. Traffic stops were being handled more professionally, officers were taking time to explain their actions, and people were beginning to feel like the police were truly there to protect and serve everyone equally. But the impact had spread far beyond Chicago. Police departments across the country had adopted similar training programs. The dashcam footage from that night was being used in academies nationwide, sparking important discussions about power, responsibility, and the true meaning of justice. Later that afternoon, Patricia visited one of the community centers where officers now regularly met with local residents. The atmosphere was different from the tense community meetings of the past. People were sharing stories, asking questions, and actually listening to each other. "Remember when officers wouldn't even get out of their cars in this neighborhood?" An elderly resident asked her. "Now look, they're playing basketball with our kids, knowing everyone's names. That's what real policing should be." The media attention had mostly faded, but the work continued. Patricia had turned down offers to write books or appear on national news shows. For her, the real story wasn't about one captain catching one officer's misconduct. It was about the quiet revolution happening in police departments everywhere. Back in her office, she reviewed the latest batch of recruit evaluations. The questions were different now. How do they handle stressful situations? Do they show signs of bias in their decision-making? Are they willing to admit mistakes and learn from them? Her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter, sharing a social media post. Someone had recognized Patricia at a coffee shop and shared their story. A routine traffic stop where the officer had been professional, respectful, and clear about every action they were taking. "Your mom's work is changing things," the post read. "One traffic stop at a time." A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was a young officer who'd been on patrol with Reynolds that night, one of many who'd stayed silent in the past about similar incidents. "Captain," she said, I need to report something I saw today. Another officer was getting aggressive during a stop. I stepped in just like we learned in training. The situation calmed down immediately. Patricia smiled, remembering how rare such reports used to be. Tell me everything, she said, reaching for her notebook. This is how we make real change happen. As the sun set over Chicago, Patricia thought about all the small victories that had led to this point. The recruiting posters in the hallway now showed a more diverse group of officers. The complaint forms were easier to access and understand. Body cameras were being treated as tools for accountability, not obstacles to be worked around. In the parking lot, she passed a traffic stop in progress. The officer was explaining clearly why they'd pulled the driver over, their body language professional and respectful. The driver, though obviously not happy about being stopped, wasn't fearful. This was progress, slow but steady, one interaction at a time. 6 months had passed since that fateful night, and the Chicago Police Department looked different now. Patricia stood at the podium in the Police Academy's main lecture hall, facing a class of fresh-faced recruits. Behind her, the screen showed dash cam footage from that night, but this time it was being used as a teaching tool. What you just watched isn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong, she told the attentive faces before her. It's about the choices we make every day when we put on this badge. The training program had been completely revamped. Instead of just teaching procedures and protocols, it now included extensive sessions on bias recognition, de-escalation techniques, and the importance of speaking up when witnessing misconduct. Officer Chen, now promoted to training coordinator, stood at the back of the room. He'd become one of the department's most vocal advocates for change, using his own experience to show other officers why staying silent wasn't an option. Your fellow officers aren't your enemies when they hold you accountable, Patricia continued, walking among the recruits. They're your allies in maintaining the trust we need to do our jobs effectively. The department's statistics told a remarkable story. Civilian complaints had dropped by 30%. More importantly, officers were now more likely to report problems they witnessed, knowing they'd be protected from retaliation. During breaks between sessions, Patricia often checked her phone. Community leaders kept her updated on the changes they were seeing on the streets. Traffic stops were being handled more professionally, officers were taking time to explain their actions, and people were beginning to feel like the police were truly there to protect and serve everyone equally. But the impact had spread far beyond Chicago. Police departments across the country had adopted similar training programs. The dashcam footage from that night was being used in academies nationwide, sparking important discussions about power, responsibility, and the true meaning of justice. Later that afternoon, Patricia visited one of the community centers where officers now regularly met with local residents. The atmosphere was different from the tense community meetings of the past. People were sharing stories, asking questions, and actually listening to each other. Remember when officers wouldn't even get out of their cars in this neighborhood? An elderly resident asked her. Now look, they're playing basketball with our kids, knowing everyone's names. That's what real policing should be. The media attention had mostly faded, but the work continued. Patricia had turned down offers to write books or appear on national news shows. For her, the real story wasn't about one captain catching one officer's misconduct. It was about the quiet revolution happening in police departments everywhere. Back in her office, she reviewed the latest batch of recruit evaluations. The questions were different now. How do they handle stressful situations? Do they show signs of bias in their decision-making? Are they willing to admit mistakes and learn from them? Her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter, sharing a social media post. Someone had recognized Patricia at a coffee shop and shared their story. A routine traffic stop where the officer had been professional, respectful, and clear about every action they were taking. Your mom's work is changing things, the post read. One traffic stop at a time. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was a young officer who'd been on patrol with Reynolds that night, one of many who'd stayed silent in the past about similar incidents. Captain, she said, I need to report something I saw today. Another officer was getting aggressive during a stop. I stepped in just like we learned in training. The situation calmed down immediately. Patricia smiled, remembering how rare such reports used to be. Tell me everything, she said, reaching for her notebook. This is how we make real change happen. As the sun set over Chicago, Patricia thought about all the small victories that had led to this point. The recruiting posters in the hallway now showed a more diverse group of officers. The complaint forms were easier to access and understand. Body cameras were being treated as tools for accountability, not obstacles to be worked around. In the parking lot, she passed a traffic stop in progress. The officer was explaining clearly why they'd pulled the driver over, their body language professional and respectful. The driver, though obviously not happy about being stopped, wasn't fearful. This was progress, slow but steady, one interaction at a time. That night at home, Patricia added another entry to the journal she'd been keeping since the incident. Change doesn't happen in one dramatic moment, she wrote. It happens in thousands of small moments when people choose to do the right thing instead of the easy thing. Her daughter had framed the original news article about the incident, but Patricia rarely looked at it anymore. She was more interested in the future than the past. The real victory wasn't in exposing one officer's misconduct, it was in creating a system where such misconduct became increasingly rare. As she got ready for bed, her phone lit up with one last message. A young recruit from that day's class had written to thank her. "Today's training changed how I think about this job," it read. "I understand now, the badge isn't about power over people, it's about responsibility to people." Patricia smiled as she turned out the light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new situations to handle, new lessons to learn. But now, at least, they were moving in the right direction, one step at a time, one officer at a time, one traffic stop at a time.